Hey there, I'm Tony from Marathon Mates. On this episode, we're doing a very special recap on the Sydney Marathon, which was run just this weekend. Are you ready to fly? Let's go.
Welcome to the thrilling world of the Flying Runner, brought to you by the Marathon Mates.
Hey there, everyone. Welcome back to the Flying RuNR Podcast for this very special one-off episode where we're doing a recap of the Sydney Marathon. Now, we've been talking about the Sydney Marathon since we started this podcast. We've been so excited because, as you know, the Sydney Marathon is vying to become one of the world major marathons. So given that we are traveling over the next couple of weeks to run in Berlin and Chicago, we just thought we'd give you listeners and viewers a very special gifts with some extra content this week. But before we talk about the Sydney Marathon, I'd just like to welcome our very special guest, one of our marathon mates, Stephen Tudjman, who's joined us tonight. Now, we first met Stephen and his wonderful wife, Kim, in London last year, October 2022 to be exact. And Sharon and I then also had the pleasure of being able to catch up with Stephen and Kim in Boston. Now, the interesting story is that Terry Frew, one of our other marathon mates, has always talked about Stephen and Kim. So it was really, really good to meet them ourselves last year in London and then to back it up with Boston. Now, Steve's been on the Stephen, amazing story, and we'll get him back to talk about it. Amazing story about Boston where he recovered from some really major stuff that happened to himself. But we'll get him back to talk about that. He's been in the running and triathlon scene for some time. He's well known right around Australia in the triathlon world. I think he's friends with everyone he meets. He's just got that sort of a personality. It's great to have him on the show. So how are you, Steve?
Tony, thanks for that huge introduction. I'm feeling a little bit overwhelmed, but no, seriously, mate, it's great to catch up with you again. And Tim and Tara, who again I had the great pleasure of meeting in London as well last year. Look, I'm pretty good, mate. Sydney Marathon was run and won yesterday. I had the good fortune to participate, and it's nice to, while the race is still fresh in my mind, have the opportunity to share some thoughts with you, Tim and Tara, and our listeners.
Yeah, that's awesome. Thanks, Stephen. And you didn't just run it. You were one of the back of the packers running as the 7-hour sweep and right at the back of the course. And I'm really keen to hear some of those stories a little bit later on, because I'm sure you've got some encouragement stories, but also some stories of disappointment potentially. So we'll can't wait to hear some of those. But before we get started, while we're away on our flying runs, and thanks Tim for that little snippet, I like that. While we're away on our flying runs, we'll be sharing updates through Facebook. Now, we'll be doing some Facebook Lives, but just to give you an understanding, 7 p.m. is probably our first one Friday night in Berlin. It'll be 7 p.m. for us. For everyone in Australia, it's probably 3 a.m. So we won't be expecting too many people to join us live. But when you get up Saturday morning, you'll be able to go for your long run potentially and listen to our Facebook Lives. I don't know. Once we get back, we'll put them all together and we'll publish them as podcast episodes, and they'll become available during October. So if you aren't following us on Facebook, please do, because you'll see our updates from Berlin and also Chicago. So Tim, I'm going to handball it to you because your Demons lost on the weekend. So let's talk about the Sydney Marathon.
You didn't have to bring that up. I was just getting over it all, Tony.
Yeah, the tears have only just dried up.
There's always next year, as they say. But well, it's good to be having an extra extra special episode, as you say, and a little bit of extra content for our listeners out there, given we're going to be away. So g'day Tara, g'day Stephen, and g'day Tony. So we're talking Sydney Marathon on this very special episode. It's been run and won, and I must say I was pretty impressed with what I saw coming out of the Sydney Marathon over the 4 or 5 days. There was good press coverage, both across social media and mainstream media. They had good government support and assistance. That was very evident. They had the Premier of New South Wales, Chris Minns, turn up to one of the media broadcasts and was there to promote it. But it started to look and feel like a world marathon major. I'm not sure, Stephen, from your perspective, but just sitting at home watching the feeds on social media or on the news, it started to look a bit like that. Don't know. It just felt that way for me. I guess the other special thing about it, which is pretty unique here in Australia, was that the marathon itself was broadcast live on free-to-air television, which is a very rare thing. It doesn't happen very often. Normally it's an Olympic event or a Commonwealth Games that they might do that. I'm not trying to think of a local event where they would have broadcast a live marathon in the past. Maybe at the City to Surf in the past in Sydney, they would have done that live many years ago, but nothing like this. It was full content. It was obviously structured at selling Sydney to the world. There was lots of advertising of the unique features of Sydney as well, the harbour, the beaches, and all the other things to do and see in Sydney. So it was quite good and refreshing to see an event here in Australia that was looking and feeling like a big time event. Some stats just briefly from the weekend. We've been talking about that there's a mandate, I guess, from the World Marathon Majors for Sydney to achieve, and Cape Town, to achieve 15,000 finishes. So I've got the numbers that have come in. These are obviously the unofficial numbers. They haven't been confirmed yet, but this is based on the official numbers that have been put out on the results pages for the Sydney Marathon weekend. They didn't quite get the 15,000 finishes. They only got 13,249. And I say only, that's the biggest number of finishes for a marathon here in Australia ever, 13,249. Almost 5,000 finishes in the half marathon, 4,926. 10,145 finishes in the 3.5K race.
No, 10.
In the 10K race, sorry. Thanks, Tara.
Thank you, Tara. Well picked up.
5,770 finishes in the 3.5K race, which brings a total of 34,090 finishes over the entire weekend, which is just phenomenal. I don't think there's now a bigger race event in Australia. 34,000 is huge. And those numbers are probably a little bit down, quite a bit down, and we'll talk to Stephen a bit more about it shortly, but they're probably a little bit down, largely because it was an unseasonably warm day yesterday in Sydney. Very hot.
Yeah.
Leading into it, for the week beforehand, they'd been doing burn-offs in the mountain areas and the national parks around Sydney. There's quite a lot of smoke in the days leading into it, and from what I understand, it was quite dry. It wasn't a humid heat, so it was quite dry and very warm, up to 30 degrees, which I think is about 86, 87 degrees Fahrenheit for those who deal in Fahrenheit. So it was very unseasonal, very, very warm, but it started to look like and feel like a major.
Yeah, and interesting when you look at those numbers, and I'm sure I heard this on the telecast. They had 5,000 people at the marathon last year, and then this year they had well over 15,000 commensurate. So when you think about that as a degree of difficulty, to triple your numbers in a year and still maintain control and actually increase that professional look as you're talking about, I think is great kudos to the organisers and the race director of the Sydney Marathon. And I mentioned to Tim and Tara prior to the episode being recorded is that the Abbots World Majors do a podcast, and I was saying that obviously we're talking about the right topics and news items because they tend to talk about the same things that we've talked about, but after we've recorded and released our episode. So we are not suggesting they are copying us at all. It just means that maybe we've just got the right topics.
But if they want to, they're more than welcome to copy us and give us credit in their podcast.
Yeah, but now I do just want to talk a little bit about the unseasonably hot stuff, because it's probably where we've there was a little bit of a media attention around things like toilet queues. Oh, my God. What we saw was nothing outside of what you would normally see in a world major. When you've got 10 to 15,000 people in one spot and they're runners and they've hydrated, people tend to need to go to the toilet. You can't necessarily have a toilet for 10,000, one toilet for every person there. So what we saw wasn't anything out of the ordinary, but there was a bit of a viral video apparently going around in relation to it. But the other thing I just want to talk about is, and we've talked about this before on the podcast, we need to listen to our body during our runs. And we've run many a major where people have had to get medical attention, whether it was London, Boston, wherever, and I think we've heard parts of my story around Boston where I was probably really close to having to put my hand up and get to a medical tent. There are always people receiving medical attention, and some people will have something sudden and unexpected happen to them, but others will push themselves to the limit. And when you've got a 30-degree day and you've got in the back of your mind that you want to run a PB, or that it's your first marathon and you think under 3 hours is where you should be heading, sometimes, and Tim spoke about this on our last one, there are some things we just don't control. The weather is one of them. And then my great advice would be back it off, listen to your body, enjoy the run. There's always tomorrow that you can chase your PB when the conditions are more like it. So slow down, back off, and give yourself the option to head out on another day. So,
100% agree. And I was just going to finish it off with some of the results, I guess, over the weekend. Do you want to read the names,
No.
Tara?
No.
Right.
I don't do the names, you know that.
I'll read the names. All right. So for the men's marathon winner was Othami El Gamuri from Morocco. He ran it in a time of 2:08.19, and it wasn't a PB for him. His PB's around 2:06, I think, from memory. At one stage, they ran about 25 Ks. They were predicting that it would be about a 2:10 finish. He was able to bring it home in 2:18. But he looked strong. He got to about 28 Ks. There was a pack of about 5 or 6 in the lead pack. And at 28 Ks in Centennial Park, just after they sort of entered Centennial Park, he started to surge. And initially, last year's winner, Guillet, followed him, but couldn't keep up with him. And he sort of got out to this lead of about 100 to 150 meters and seemed to hold that lead more or less all the way to the finish. So for about the last 7 Ks, he held that lead and deserved to win. And I think it's fitting that El Goumri from Morocco won it, given that Morocco's been through some problems with earthquakes and a huge issue back home. So maybe that might uplift some of the people and the locals in Morocco. On the female side, the marathon winner was Betsy Sainer from the USA. She ran it in a time of 2:26. For the first 35 Ks or so, there was a pack there. It split down into about 2 or so people. And then from sort of 35 Ks onwards, Betsy started to surge ahead. She followed the pacer. She had a pacer with her pretty much all the way to the finish line, which is a rare thing. And largely held a lead for those last 5-7 Ks. But the second place finisher did come home really quick. And in the end, Betsy just won it by 6 seconds. So it was interesting because it is a long downhill finish. And after all those hills, and I'll get your take on this, Stephen, in a second, but after all those hills, to have a long downhill finish for about 1 kilometre to the finish line, your quads must have been burning at the end there, I'd reckon, Stephen.
Yeah, it's a different. I'm used to uphill finishes, uphill climbs to finishes. So it was certainly, I think, a different type of finish. It's different from the way Sydney has felt in the past. The last few Sydneys I've done, it's a flat finish. This was different from the years gone past. Wayne had redesigned the course, I think, quite deliberately, as was quite public. Quite a few of the people that I was with on the day, whenever we were doing downhill sections, found that was hard, ironically.
Yeah,
Yeah.
very much so. It's also important, Tim, to note the first two Aussies home, Brett Robinson, Sinead Diver, both came 8th in their respective categories.
Yeah.
Sinead was 2:31 as a time, and Brett was 2:23. So once again, a great effort. It was a great time, great run by both of them. I think Brett struggled early, from what I recall from the telecast. He looked like he was struggling, but he came home strongly. So, well done to both Brett and Sinead. So,
and Maddie Garozio won the wheelchair as well, the females wheelchair.
Isn't she a legend?
Oh, she's got the most beautiful smile, best personality. We met her in Tokyo, and she's just the nicest person you'll ever come across. She's just lovely.
We literally just walked up to her at a crossing on the road there, didn't we? And she was crossing the road, and we had to chat to her while we were waiting for the traffic lights to change. So
You're spot on. Kim and I met Maddie when we returned to Sydney after Berlin and London, and literally we'd been flying all night, and without any hesitation, she was happy to stop and have a chat to us. And then we saw her again in Boston in this year, and again had a chat to her then. And you're right, that beaming smile and just the willingness to stop and have a chat is very refreshing of such a terrific athlete. She's a first-class athlete on the field. She's a first-class athlete off the racetrack. So, just consistent.
Absolutely. Beautiful personality inside and out. She's just, she's probably one of my favourite runners, I think. So,
They had up those hills yesterday too. I think some of those wheelies, they really struggled, particularly up that long climb. Is it Macquarie Street that takes you up towards Centennial Park there?
And Macquarie Chair. I miss Macquarie Street.
No, Macquarie Street it is, I think it is.
On the way out to Centennial Park.
Yeah, there's a lot of wheelies struggling to get up that hill.
So, Steve, let's get your opinion now and your thoughts around what you've just been through with the Sydney Marathon. To us, it felt like it had a real feel and a vibe that we've had before in World Majors. How did it feel being involved as much as you were? Did it feel like a major?
Yes, and like you, for many, many months leading up to yesterday, it felt like something special was happening. And I do have to disclose that I do know the race director, Wayne Larden. I used to work with Wayne back in the early 2000s when we were working in a big financial services company. And I've stayed in touch with Wayne a lot of the years. And so for probably the last 12 months, I've been regularly touching base and saying, look, how are we going with numbers, particularly since it was announced that we were going to be one of the candidate events for the Abbots World Majors. And what clear to me is Wayne had a very clear vision around what he wanted to do to be able to put forward the race in a way that put our best foot forward yesterday. So it certainly felt like it from the outside, but it equally felt like it from inside the race. For me, I spoke to Wayne about 2 weeks ago and I said, look, how are we travelling? I was monitoring how we were going with the numbers. And when he sort of pointed out that we needed the 15,000 to finish, I said, look, is there something I can do? I'm happy to, be at the back of the pack. So he put me in touch with Simon, who organised the pacing crew. And before I knew it, I was a pacer and I was one of the sweepers yesterday. First time ever as a sweeper, and it was an enormous amount of fun. It gave me an opportunity both yesterday and at the expo, which started on Thursday, the opportunity to see what the race felt like from within, being part of, the crew, the volunteers, the many thousands of volunteers who made yesterday so successful. For me, probably one of the touchstones was the number of international athletes I met who had come out to race. And I haven't looked at what the field was based on the published stats, but it just felt like a major where so many people had travelled from the other side of the world. I'd met a young girl who'd flown in from Belgium that morning, on Thursday morning. There was a lot of people from the States. Probably half the people I spoke to had come in or were there was a young girl from Mexico living here in Australia. So it really felt like that international feel. It wasn't just a group of Aussies from different states and territories that had, turned up to do the race. There was a genuine feel about it from the number of people who had travelled from far and wide to come here. That was probably the first point for me. The second was, again, talking to, particularly on Thursday, talking to the athletes around what their expectations were. And there was a real mixture of people who were experienced, and there was a lot of first-timers who'd come to step up to do their race. And again, it had a feel about it that they, particularly the first-timers, there was something special about Sydney that the reason why they had signed up to do the race. So all of the marketing, all of the advertisements, all of the things that Wayne and the team had been doing to promote the event had caught the attention of people who were willing to part with their hard-earned cash to fly from one side of the world to the other to actually come and participate in Sydney. Then on race day itself, again, there was the same feel. I met throughout the day a lot of people from fellow competitors in the race. And again, it reinforced that many of them had travelled far and wide to come here. Some were successful. Some made the decision to withdraw early on in the race or later in the race because of the conditions and injuries that they'd sustained during their training, which meant the right thing to do, Tony, as you said early on, was to save yourself for another day. Yeah. So, in simple terms, yes, it certainly had that feeling that there was something special about it. One question you may ask is, what did the crowds on the course feel like? Well, for those of us that have been lucky enough to do New York and London and experience the crowds there, I think that is unique. I think it's very, very hard for any other race, Berlin, Boston, to replicate that, even Chicago, which I've done. But Sydney had a different feel about it yesterday from which I've been used to in the past, potentially because of the number of athletes who participated in the 10 and 21 Ks before the marathon started. And a number of them, I met a few this morning when we checked out of the hotel. I said, I remember you running through. We were sitting in the rocks, at the cafes there. And we remember you coming through. And I remember me, of course, telling you to leave a beer for me. So there was something. So again, I think that the idea there was a lot of talk on social media around the wisdom of the 5 and sort of 10 and 21 starting so early. But personally, I think it added to the atmosphere because a lot of those people hung around and were converted into support crew on the side of the roads as we came through.
Yeah, and I think Wayne had a concept of live zones, didn't he? There was 4 or 5 live zones during the course proper, and I think that concept is probably something new for the Australian public, and that can only grow. So I would imagine that there is nothing but growth ahead for the Sydney Marathon. So let's talk about the expo. What was it like?
I liked it. Again, I was there in a work capacity, if you like. I was there to do a job, but I did get there early and put my consumer hat on, or athlete hat on. And there was a lot of good, probably a mixture of what I call product exhibitors that were there. There was other events were being advertised, at the expo, which I'll touch on. There were charities that were there that were vying for, the opportunity for athletes to consider donating to charities, given that, we do spend a lot of money on product. So we should, share some of that with people who have less. From a product perspective, there was an Aussie company called Adjust a Mattress that were there, and I met the lady there quite a few times, and they, it's an Aussie-made product that's designed to help many of us deal with sleep issues, whether it's, a good night's sleep before a marathon or generally. Our friends from ASIC were there, Chafe No More, Fixed Nutrition, who were the sponsor, the hydration sponsor on the race course yesterday, Flip Belting, Gingy, Goo, Andrew Lloyd's company, who distributes it here in Australia, Nathan, Pain Pod, Pillar Performance, Race Dot, Shocks. Bought the latest Shocks, the ones that go around. I used them on Saturday, and they're pretty good. Steigen, Theragun, our good friends from Travelling Fit, Murray Marr was there, alongside Marathon Tours that partner with Travelling Fit in a lot of the events like Petra, the Petra Desert Marathon and the Great Wall of China Marathon. So I had a good chat to the team there. So it was a good mixture of both product promoters, lots of people coming through. I mean, I was there for probably about 6 hours on Thursday, and there's a good steady stream of people right through till the 8 o'clock close. We had to kick people out because they were still keen on. So it had a good feel about it.
So with the expo that was held at Alexandria, which is somewhere between the airport and the CBD area of Sydney, how was it as far as getting access to it public transport wise? Because sometimes these expos can be quite a way out from where everyone's staying. It can be quite difficult. Was that easy to get to and get home from?
Look, I found it easy, and again, being a local Sydney sider, I sort of know the system. I walked there. I caught a train from home to one of the train stations nearby. You had a combination of Mascot, Green Square, or St Peter's. It took me about a K and a half. Now, again, I'd tested that with some of my pacer colleagues who had got there earlier, and they again had walked the course. But for people who chose to not do what I did and walk there from public transport, there was a shuttle bus that ran every 15 minutes from the expo to Redfern and Green Square stations, which were nearby. I think the call to the athletes was avoid driving if you can, particularly on peak times. But I noticed that there was quite a good degree of parking around as well. So whether you chose to take public transport, use the shuttle bus service, do what I did and walk or drive, it was reasonably well accessible.
Yeah, it's good to hear, because I sort of know where that venue is, or the venue. I know where it is roughly in Alexandria there, and it could probably be a little bit out of the way for some people, particularly if you're north of the harbour. But having good access from the train stations nearby and the shuttle bus, that's really good that they considered that, because sometimes these things can be a pain in the ass to get to, and let alone find your way there, especially if you're a tourist. So that sounds good.
Yeah, my natural inclination is to drive, but when I read the race briefing, it seemed to me that we were being very much encouraged to take public transport or use the shuttle bus option. So it actually made it easy.
Yeah. And so on race day, the morning of race day, how was it trying to get to North Sydney to the start line?
Yeah, I've done it quite a few times, so it's relatively straightforward. You get off at Milsons Point Station, which is literally about 500 metres from the Bradfield Park under the northern pylon of the Harbour Bridge, just above Luna Park, for those who you look at the North Sydney Olympic Swimming Pool. It's pretty easy to get to. I live down in the southern suburbs of Sydney, so Kim and I parked at Kirrawee Station up the road from home, caught a train straight through into the city, into Town Hall, got off, walked up a platform upstairs. A train came along within 5 minutes, took us straight to Milsons Point. So a lot of people could get to the right train line from Central Station. So again, wherever you came from in the south, it's relatively easy to get there. The northern suburbs line, it's very easy to single train. It was very crowded, I've got to confess. When we got off the train at Milsons Point Station, you did need to be patient and take your time, because there's a narrow 2 sets of stairs taking you down to the ground floor. So it was quite crowded, but the athletes were in good frame of mind. I did get there early. I needed to get there early to be with the pacing crew before the 10 and 21 athletes went off. So it was probably, compounded the issue, but people were patient. There was a number of good coffee shops down the bottom of Milsons Point Station, and there was a few ready for people to have their last caffeine shot. And the toilet situation, Tony, that you referred to at the beginning of the podcast, there was lots of queues there. I think one of my suggestions to the race organisers, to Wayne and the team, would be we probably needed some marshals, because there were some toilets that were not as busy as others if you knew where to go. So I think it's more just, again, and also probably helping people prioritise getting the 10K athletes done first, and then the 21 and then the marathoners. So again, because I met a young girl that was on course with me for a little while, was a 10K runner and missed the start. So she convinced the race organisers to give her a bib. They gave her a marathon bib. And I think she had in mind she was going to run the marathon. And of course, we said, I had a chat to her in the first 5Ks, and, you know, she pulled off. She ran 15 and pulled off. But she was worried. She wanted to participate. The queues were that she had to wait. All's well that ended well.
And Bradfield Park, which is the starting area, I know that area well. I used to do a lot of work back in the day in North Sydney. I know that start hill that you go up, but the park itself, was it big enough for 34,000 finishes? That's a pretty small area from what I remember.
Well, for starters, yes. What I found was that for people, there was enough area. If you weren't on the queues to the toilets, there was enough area for people just to lay down and relax and do their final stretching before they were ready to join the queue. So it was crowded, but not overly so.
Okay.
Yeah, excellent. Right. So the course itself, Steve, so looking at some of the commentary on Facebook, people acknowledge it was brutal, it was tough, and, you know, the conditions weren't ideal. But there was a lot of talk about the up and backs and the uphill. So give us a real life, your thoughts around the course itself. You've obviously a resident of Sydney. I think one of the comments I saw was that they think the course has changed 10 times in 10 years. Now, I don't know how true that is, of course, but what were your thoughts around the course, and how did you find it?
Well, Tony, I'll deal with the final point about the course changing. The Sydney Marathon used to be run back in the 90s by Dave Cundy, who was very well known in the sport and who was very instrumental in the Canberra Marathon. And then it died for a while, and it was resurrected in 2000. So the host City Marathon, which was held on the 30th of April 2000, a test event for the Olympics. That course took you started at Bradfield Park over the bridge, but you ended up out at the Olympic Park. You ran into the Olympic venue. The course then went through some subtle refinements for a few years after that, and then we dropped the idea of finishing out at the Olympic Park, the Olympic venue, and then finishing at the Opera House. And then at that time, even within then, there's been subtle changes to the course. I think yesterday was better. I think Wayne talked a lot about the redesign was done in a way to try and deal with some of the technical nature of the course and the undulations in a way which were more beneficial for the athletes. So for me, I preferred a lot of the hills, the undulation sections of the course got out of the road relatively early in the course. Centennial Park's relatively flat. There's a few gentle rises there. Overall, I think the course was designed well. What was funny at the expo was that where our pacer tent was, where there were huge maps of the course profile, and the number of people that just stopped and looked at the course profile and were somewhat apprehensive about what it showed. But of course, as we all know, the course profile looks worse than what it feels on race day.
Control the elevation.
That's right. I actually looked at my Garmin stats tonight, and whether this is right or not, my total ascent was only 55 metres across the course. So it's not that hilly. There's a couple of sections. You've obviously got the first section out of Bradfield Park, which is a bit of a climb. The Harbour Bridge is always deceptive because you've got a gentle climb up to the centre section of the bridge. There was a section as you head into Pyrmont where you do go up over one of the bridges to take you in at the back. It's relatively flat throughout there. There's a couple of small, any of the climbs are generally short. So there's a couple up at the back of Pyrmont. I thought what they did well was when we ended up in Mrs. Macquarie's chair, there's a notorious section where if you go down on the western side of Mrs. Macquarie's chair and come up on the eastern side, you've got this really sharp pinch just before the art gallery. They reversed it. So we actually went down the pinch, which was then for a lot easier. So little things like that I think did make a difference, certainly for me, who is familiar with the old course.
Yeah, I found it interesting. They were interviewing one of the elite athletes after the race, and they actually made mention that they enjoyed the fact that the course the up and backs, and they were on one side of the road running this way, and they had the masses on the other side of the road running that. And that's something that that they don't experience a lot in any world major, because they're normally out there by themselves. So it gave them, from what I heard, a completely different perspective around, and something new that they hadn't encountered before, which I think can be perceived as a positive.
Well, as you know, Boston's one way, Tony, and so you don't get the benefit of seeing your friends and loved ones who are doing the race. Berlin's the same, London's the same. I saw Kim out there looking fantastic at about the 35k mark.
Terry through, may we add?
Terry was right behind her. And then the story was that after they saw me, the wheels fell off and they just helped one another get home. still did a very respectable just over 4 hours. So that, for the day it was
great effort.
But I do think that aspect of the course I've always enjoyed, about the ability to have sections where you can see other people, people you've started the race with. So I caught up with probably half a dozen people I knew that were in the race that I hadn't seen at the start, that I was able to see on course as we passed one another.
I don't know about you, Steve, but I find that seeing those people, it sort of takes the distraction away from what you're feeling as well, because you're looking out for somebody that you're as you're going through. So you're constantly watching, and then all of a sudden 5Ks is gone and you're like, oh, that's gone really, really fast, because you're too busy watching for somebody else.
Yeah, Tara, that's part of how I do my races. It's that distraction, all that.
Yep.
I must admit also the finishing shoot has probably got to be one of the most spectacular finishing shoots in the world of marathoning, I think. There are some pretty spectacular ones around the world, but finishing in front of the Opera House, having the harbour bridge off to the left-hand side, stunning blue skies, a sparkling harbour, you can see why it's going to draw a lot of people from around the world to come in for that finish line, and that finish line photo and opportunity afterwards to get a photo in front of the Opera House and the Sydney Harbour Bridge. How was that feeling coming into the finishing shoot?
I'm glad that, as somebody who's living north of the border, I'm glad you said it, because I feel I'm biased. So
I can tell you something offline about my real feelings about Sydney, but the best bit about Sydney is the harbour, and there is no doubt about that. But it's just that it's very locked up, that people don't really get a chance to get, particularly locals. You don't get a chance to really see much of the harbour, because a lot of it is private land right up to the water.
Right. Look, it was pretty special, particularly for a number of the athletes that I supported home yesterday who were struggling in the heat. And for them, knowing that was their finish, and I said to one of them as we were probably half a K away, and the athlete started to tear up, and I said, it's okay. This is what I want you to do. There is that emotion that's pent up. You're going to see one of the most beautiful sights as you round the corner. And even for those of us at the back of the pack, there was a really good atmosphere at the finish. So again, credit to all of the people that were there for us to come home at the back of the pack. It made us all feel very special.
So, Steve, you ran with one of our other good friends, Lucia. She was the 7-hour pacer as well with you guys. And I guess being those back of the packers, you would have a lot of first-time marathoners. I know Lucia being a Sydney sider as well. Do you feel that having that local knowledge, both of you, and with those sometimes newbies at the back of the pack, it was really quite emotional for you as well as the runners to see, you knew what you were coming home to. Do you feel that knowing that and being able to encourage those people was really emotional for you as well?
Yeah, look, I it's the first time I've ever officially been involved in encouragement. Of course, you guys know me well enough to know that I like to do that.
You're always encouraging.
And as you're striding past, yes.
Yes.
For those who don't know, Channel 9 did a coverage of the Ironman in I think it was Foster that particular year, and we had a friend of ours that was doing her first, and Channel 9 filmed me talking underwater. So yes, I have a reputation. But yesterday was different in the sense that I did have a job, and the job was that myself and John were the official sweepers on the course, and we had charts which told us very clearly what time of day we needed to be at each kilometre mark. And so part of yesterday was about right from the very beginning, communicating with the athletes that we were with and understanding what their strategy was, how they were feeling. So we got over the bridge, we were coming down onto the Western Distributor, and there was a young guy who was a blind athlete, and he had two of the wonderful Achilles team members running with him. And so I went up to them and I said, look, help me understand what's your strategy for today. You know, sort of need to, and they said, look, we want to go at this same pace the whole way. We don't want to go too hard too early. And, you know, throughout the day, we were talking to one another. I'm happy to say they all got home and got their medals. They were towards the back of the pack. But again, part of the day was engaging with the athletes as early as possible to understand where they were at. You know, some of the athletes, I had Philip and Linda who'd flown over from the United States. Philip had an injury in his training. It was clear that he was struggling. And so again, part of the communication was understanding what they wanted to achieve, and they were happy to peel off at the 15K mark as we went through past the Opera House the first time to go off into the hotel and say, I've done enough for the day, I'll come back another day. So a lot of it was really trying to offer encouragement, but in a very different way. It was trying to get into the heads of the athlete, understanding what they were feeling, and communicate with them and talk to them about their options throughout the day.
Yeah, great strategy. Now, we are pushing up against the time that we'd sort of set, so I just need to hasten some things up. Now, the big news that was announced before the marathon is that Sydney will be hosting the 2024 Abbots World Majors Age Group World Championships. Now, this is huge news because it's Chicago hosting the 2023, of which your wife, Kim, is participating in.
Been invited to participate.
Yeah.
Which I'm very proud of.
Yeah, very much so. And it's the first time that anyone outside of the World Majors is actually hosting this event. So I think that's an enormous kudos to the Sydney Marathon.
It's huge. It's absolutely, for the reasons you described, Tony, it's the first time. It gives us a rare opportunity again next year to create the same environment. Hopefully it won't be as hot next year, but we'll come back to that in a minute. But it's a tremendous vote of confidence, I think, from the Abbots World Group, the Abbots Group, for what we can do. We have an opportunity again to continue to be diligent, do the work, you know, as good organisations always do, learn from, you know, feedback from yesterday, tweak things to improve things. But it's an enormous opportunity for us to really showcase Sydney in its great light again.
Yeah, absolutely.
That World Age Championships is going to be bringing some very fast runners out there, because they have different qualifying marks for each age group. But to give you an idea, just for the men's category, if you're 59 years or less, you need to be running sub 3 hours to qualify.
It's extraordinary.
For it.
Wow.
And if you're a woman, 59 years or less, it's sub 3 hours 30. So unless you got one of those times, you don't get invited to the event. But it means we're going to have some pretty fast runners out there in the field. And I was only looking at it yesterday when I was watching the elites. It seemed like there was elites, and then there was a bit of a gap, and some occasional runners coming through before the sort of the main bulk of the runners came through for the finishing line. I suspect next year it will just be one steady stream of runners from 2 hours, 8 minutes through to, you know, the 7 hours back of the packers. It's going to be a huge field with some very serious runners in there. So I'm really looking forward to that and hearing about it. One other question I've got for you as well, Stephen, just briefly. I've seen some things on social media about not enough drink stations, or the aid stations didn't have water at some of them. Is that true? I doubt that would have been.
Yeah, look, I was at the back of the field, and every aid station we went past had adequate water and fix. So we never had an issue. Whether it was people, I don't know, but from my vantage point, there was more than enough. I think the first aid station was 5Ks into the marathon, and then they were roughly every 2 to 2.5 kilometres thereafter. You also had the opportunity, permitting, depending on what was happening. It was easier for me at the back. There were aid stations on the other side of the road, so again, you could always peel over, go to that aid station, come back on course. Obviously, a lot harder at the front, with the people at the front of the pack, but I thought there was more than enough out there. But Wayne did put extra aid stations out there, given what we knew the forecast was going to be.
Yeah. It's just I guess just looking for feedback as hopefully the organisers continue to be. I think streaming was amazing. It was a very professionally run and broadcast event. So I think that was a real tick. The one thing that I was a bit confused about was the size of the bib. I think there's a real opportunity there. I don't think it really highlighted those elite runners as well as what it could have. And maybe we look for the last name on the bib as opposed to the first name for those elite runners. But, at the end of the day, I think when you go through some of the commentary, most participants seem to be very, very happy with the way the event went. Of course, they say it was tough and it was brutal, and we understand that. But I think that even gives people a greater sense of pride that they ran in the first candidate race for the World Majors, and it was a tough day, and they got through it. So I think congratulations all around to the Sydney Marathon team. I think a great event. And Steve, thanks for your insight into the event itself, and I'm sure that the listeners have enjoyed that.
Tony, and thank you. And I just want to give a shout out to my fellow pacing team who I asked them today, I told them that I was going to be on your podcast tonight, Tony, and I asked them to share some stories. And the universal theme from all of them was just the positive impact that the day had for them on helping others get home, and they enjoyed the experience as much as what they know the athletes enjoyed from them. So a huge shout out to Simon and the team for doing a wonderful job. It was a privilege to be a part of.
Yeah.
Even if you were 6 minutes too fast or 5 minutes too fast off the 7 hour pace.
Well, perhaps another podcast episode might need to be devoted to that, Tim.
With only 5 minutes in front after 7 hours is pretty spot on pacing. That's pretty good.
Yeah, absolutely. And a huge shout out to all the volunteers, because events like Sydney just don't happen without volunteers. So we really do shake each and every one of their hands and give them a huge pat on the back, because they do an amazing job. So
we can't run unless they volunteer, so we appreciate it.
Absolutely.
One of the benefits about being at the back of the pack was one of the we were able to thank them because they were there when we needed them. So you're spot on, Tony. It was a huge day from so many people.
Yeah. So we've got rid of that Tim's Funny segment that really was liked by, I think, 3 listeners. And we now do Tim's tip. So here we go. What's your tip, Tim?
So this one's about, again, running in the heat. So Sydney's brought the attention to the heat and running in the heat. And one of the things I really noted, and I'll notice it more when I'm in Berlin for the opposite reason, but looking at the crowds, plenty of runners yesterday wearing hats. But when we go to Berlin, you'll find there's not many wearing hats. But when you're running in the heat, you've got to provide shade as best you can. Hats are good for providing some shade, keeps the sun off you a little bit. It's all about hydration, obviously, making sure you're hydrated well in advance before you go and run in the heat, but also monitoring your sweat levels when you are running, making sure you are sweating. The moment you stop sweating is the moment you're dehydrated. It's the moment you're about to head into heat stress. So keeping an eye on those sweat levels, making sure you're drinking regularly, small sips. You don't need huge amounts of water, but just small sips. And just, trying to find those shady bits where you can, whether it's a hat or whether it's under the trees. I noticed yesterday a lot of runners in Centennial Park would have enjoyed the leafy sections through there. It would have cooled a little bit. Yeah, so it's all about those little things, finding those small little 1% things, a hat, a bit of shade, just monitoring your water intake, your sweat levels, putting a bit of a cooling towel around you, just putting some water on your face just to get that air and that cooling air over your face and your hands and your body. It all helps when you're running the heat. So that's my tip for this week.
Thanks, Tim. Awesome tips. Especially coming from Queenslanders who run in 34-degree heat quite frequently.
Yeah.
So just to reconfirm to everybody, there will not be any episodes of the podcast over the next couple of weeks while we're running these events, which is Berlin and Chicago, obviously. We will have our next episodes drop for this one and also our Berlin one this week. But stay in touch for our ones when we're in Berlin and in Chicago via Facebook Lives and social media. So Instagram, Facebook, YouTube, I think we'll be putting something up on there. So in our next podcast, we'll be talking all about Berlin Marathon. Just a few days' time. Yes, 2 sleeps for all of us to go, which is great. We're talking about our journey there, our race plans. We'll have some fun along the way, and we can't wait to miss it. So stay tuned. Tony, up to you now.
All right, awesome. We hope you've enjoyed this episode of The Flying Runner. If you did enjoy the episode, please like, subscribe wherever you've listened or watched. Remember, our videos are available on Spotify and YouTube, and audio is available on most podcast platforms, but the big ones are obviously Apple, Amazon, and Google. Make sure you follow us on Facebook for our updates during Berlin and Chicago. And as always, our links are in the show notes. Thanks again, Steve, for joining us. Really enjoyed having you on the podcast. And for everyone listening, every step forward is a victory. Lace up, hit the road, and we'll catch you on the next episode. Until then, happy running.
Happy running.
Guys, take care. Be well.
Thanks, Steve. See ya.